Hello everyone, and thank you very much for supporting me here on Patreon. One of you contacted me last night to say that he'd like to see me do a video on prayer and meditation. That's a great idea. I'm going to do that tomorrow, in fact. Tonight, I'm speaking about a subject that is probably, it's as deep as it goes, essentially. And this is going to be a challenging video for me to make. I've been kind of cheeky with my public videos this week because you know how I tend to try and address popular subject matter. This week I've just felt led to dispense with that and just go for the overt spirituality, which is why none of the videos I've made this week have broken 100 views. That's the price you pay. But this one, you know, the way it goes normally is that the videos that I make on Patreon here, they tend to be the deeper videos anyway, but usually it's okay if I give myself the day of the video to prepare. You know, all these live streams take a degree of preparation and thought, unless I'm just speaking completely off the top of my head. But in the case of this one, I've thought about it all week because I knew I was going to make this video tonight, and I've been looking forward to it, but I knew it was going to be very challenging, and it's really hard to know where to begin talking about this subject because we are getting into the depths of spirituality here. But what we're doing tonight is really abstract stuff, and that's part of what makes it challenging. Of course, any mystic or any genuine spiritual teacher is going to emphasize the directly experiential, but if we are to discuss these things, if these things are to be articulated, we do have to get abstract sometimes in order to share what we're trying to say. So I guess the first thing that occurred to me when I thought about how to present this information is, well, precisely that, how to present it. What is this live stream conveying exactly? Because it's not my usual conveyance of something I've learned through my own experience. What this is something that some knowledge that I've taken in that has shed an interesting perspective on something, and I'm still letting that mellow within my own mind, if you like. And so what I'm basically doing in this live stream is presenting this information to you as well, but hopefully explaining it in a far more coherent way than the book from which it comes explains it, and in light of my own perspective as well. So really, this is just food for thought. Now, it is hard to know where to begin because this subject touches on a lot of things. First of all, I've talked many times about how individuals misunderstand the meaning of love in the Bible. They mistake it for being solely an emotion. And if you do that, you can't understand properly much of what the Bible says, because love is an act before it's an emotion. So when Jesus tells his disciples that they are to love their enemies, he's not saying that they have to force themselves to have some emotional disposition that they don't have. What he's saying is that regardless of how you feel about your enemies, you must act in a benevolent fashion towards them. Now, I don't want to go into that subject again because I don't like to repeat myself, and you've heard it often enough. Now, that is absolutely true. That is the proper biblical understanding of love. That love is an act before it's anything. And so if you try to understand the statement that is found in, for example, 1 John, that God is love, in light of that, you would naturally conclude, as I have previously, that what he's saying there is not that God is a maelstrom of emotion. That's certainly not what he's saying. But he could be understood to be saying that God is infinitely benevolent. Now, the perspective I'm going to present you with tonight offers a different take on what it means that God is love. And again, it's one that goes to the heart of spirituality. And it's something that has to be elaborated upon in these rather abstract ways. So if you've watched my last few Patreon streams, you'll know that the understandings I'm sharing with you, they come from this book that Neurocraft recommended to me, Meditations on the Tarot, A Journey into Christian Hermeticism. As I said, this was written by an anonymous author who lived from 1900 to 1973, he died in 1973, and then after his death, according to his wishes, this book was published anonymously. Now, I know the name of the guy because of the internet. It's not difficult to find the name of the guy. He is a very respected figure in many ways, not just in terms of the esoteric. But it became very clear to me reading this book that he and I are going to differ on some, what I regard as actually very minor matters. The first thing to be said is that last week, I think it was, I articulated the fact that I'd read a minority of negative reviews of this book, and they were essentially complaining that the book wasn't about the tarot. And at the time I talked about this last week, I'd read maybe 8 pages of this book. And so what I said was, I understand what those negative reviews mean because it's not about the tarot in terms of divination. But I've read far more of the book since then. In fact, I would have loved to have read all of it, but I've had to stop myself because the book is so dense. And I can just tell that the more I read, the more I'm going to want to talk about on live stream. So I don't want to read too far ahead and end up with like the next few weeks of videos planned out and me wanting to talk about those things but not able to yet. So I want to kind of pace my reading of the book with any monologues that I want to give regarding its content. But having read further in the book now, it actually goes deeper than the fact that the focus of the author is not really on divination, which is true, but it goes beyond that because, as I said last week, each of the chapters is based on a card of the major arcana of the tarot. There's 22 of them, so there's 22 chapters in the book. But within these chapters, in elaborating upon the significance of each of the major arcana, he goes really deep into theology, especially Christian theology. And this is one of the key areas where I differ from this Christian hermeticist, is that he is very much a Trinitarian. And there's a lot of things that he says that I, in some cases, disagree with. In other cases, I'm sure are flatly false. But this is a good example of how we may disagree with an individual in one area, or we may even know for a fact that they're wrong in one area. That doesn't mean they don't have anything worthwhile to say on any area. So when I'm reading this book, I don't just shut it the moment I come across some Trinitarian affirmation. I'm not that closed-minded. And it's very good for me. This is a good example of why it's beneficial to you as an individual not to be so closed-minded, not to be so bigoted, as it were. And that's the proper definition of a bigot, is when you can't tolerate a difference of opinion, which ironically makes those who use the term bigot more than anyone else the biggest bigots that there are. But he has something to say on the subject of God as love that really, really gave me pause for thought. And because I've consumed so much intellectual information concerning the spiritual, it's rare that a book tells me something I didn't know before, and it's even more rare that a book makes me go, got a good point here. But I feel I need to emphasize that the differences that I mentioned between myself and this individual, they are what I regard as very superficial differences. I mean, I mentioned the fact that he's a Trinitarian. What are we talking about when we talk about understanding God as a triune being, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 persons, 1 essence? We're talking about our theology concerning God, our conceptions concerning God. To me, and I know for a fact this author would agree with me, that is relatively minor next to the direct experience of the spiritual. So I don't really care about those differences. And if this author were still alive now, I know that we would get on extremely well. Neither of us would be petty enough to allow those kind of theological differences be some kind of barrier to us as souls. The book is written in a very interesting way. Each chapter is written as a letter to the anonymous friend, who is whoever happens to be reading the book. So I want to share with you what he has to say on God as love. But before I do, I need to refresh your mind on certain understandings that I've elaborated upon before, because they're directly relevant to what the author has to say here. And unless you have these understandings in your mind, then you're going to get lost immediately when I start elaborating upon what this guy has to say, because this is one of the most dense books I've ever read. Again, not as impenetrable as Aleister Crowley's Book of Thoth, but really, really dense. You can't possibly read a single passage in this book without stopping to reflect upon what's being said, because if you don't have what's being said settled in your mind, if the understanding hasn't solidified in your mind, and you just continue on, give it half an hour and you're lost, basically. So here's what I want to remind you of. It's my model of God. And I'm always keen to emphasize when we're looking at illustrations such as the one before you now, that they are just illustrations. We cannot accurately represent God in some kind of model or diagram. This is the mistake that religionists so often make, is that they think they can capture God in their theologies, capture God in their illustrations, and capture God in their models. And of course they can't. So I'm always very keen to emphasize that illustrations are precisely that. They exist merely to point our mind in the right direction concerning God, even though, as those who walk the spiritual path, we know that ultimately it's only an experiential meeting with God that is going to bring full illumination through what we might call gnosis. So, this is the way, for example, the Valentinian Gnostics sometimes conceived of things, and I think it's a good model. So, on the outside of these concentric circles here, you have what is called in the New Testament the fullness of Spirit. The Apostle Paul uses that statement or that term several times. In modern terminology, we call that consciousness. So this is spirit/consciousness at its fullest. There's a book in the New Testament that refers to this as the unapproachable light within which God dwells, and I think that is a wonderful way to put it. That's why I used it in this little model here. And the reason that's so relevant, I believe, despite the fact that statement, an unapproachable light, was written 2,000 years ago, is that even now you'll hear many near-death testimonies where individuals were surrounded by what seemed to be a wall of light, and it was a really bright, pure light, but not in a blinding way. And when they ask the entities about them, what does this light mean, what does it signify, the response they get is, that is God. And so it's a very powerful, a very evocative phrase or term, the unapproachable light within which God dwells. Now, within this, because all of creation is consciousness operating on some level, within this we have these different areas here, and these areas introduce different degrees of deficiency. And I'm not going to go into as much depth on this as I have in the past, first of all because it's not necessary, and second of all because I don't like to repeat myself, as I said. So we've got the ethereal astral realm, just as we have ethereal astral bodies within which to travel this realm. So this is the fullness of spirit made a little bit deficient. And the reason deficiency has to be introduced is because in the fullness of spirit there is only that pure unity. Therefore there can be no creation, because creation depends upon duality. Duality depends upon deficiency to some degree. Therefore duality is introduced to allow there to be a creation of some kind. And so we have our ethereal forms in order that we can traverse the ethereal realm, or as some call it, the astral realm. And then we have the mind. Now we have our intellects, and there is the intellectual realm that we interact with on a daily basis. And finally we have the most deficient and the most crude of all the realms, which is the material realm. It's the world, the physical world we see around us. Now, God dwells in this unapproachable light, and in all of my elaborations on spirituality, I have said much about the spirit and not so much about God. What is the distinction between spirit and God? Well, despite what Trinitarians might think, it's not as complicated as they make out. The spirit of God is to God what your physical flesh is to your brain in terms of your body. As I sometimes put it, the Spirit of God is the essence of God, but that which we call God it signifies intent. And this is very important to understand because, as I explain in my book, broadly speaking, in this world, there are two kinds of spiritual path. There's the devotional, which, as the name suggests, is a devotion to some kind of what might be called a higher intelligence. And so the Abrahamic faiths, for example, are all devotional because they all worship a single God that is understood as having some kind of intent. But then in this world, you also get the introspective spiritual paths. And Buddhism is easily the most popular example where, Buddhists differ from one Buddhist to another. Certainly if you're comparing Western Buddhism to Eastern Buddhism and so on, and Tibetan Buddhism to the kind of Buddhism you'd find in India and Pakistan and places like that. But broadly speaking, Buddhism is an introspective path in the sense that it doesn't recognize a higher intelligence of that kind, but it does recognize what you might describe, and what I have described, as an impersonal force. Now, I explain in my book that regardless of whether an adherent, one on the spiritual path, walks the introspective path or the devotional path, they will ultimately meet. Because the one who engages in introspection is naturally coming to know himself by doing so. The one who engages in devotion is coming to know God by doing so. But as souls, we are of the same essence. We are of the Spirit of God. So if you come to know yourself through introspection, you naturally will inevitably come to know God. If you come to know God through devotion, you will naturally come to know yourself. Because you can't know yourself truly without knowing God, and you can't know God without coming to truly know yourself, because we are one in spirit. We are of the same essence, of the same consciousness. I'm very clear about that. So, experientially, to me, it makes no difference. It's one of those things that is a matter of personhood, if you prefer. There are some that are naturally feel more inclined towards the devotional path. That would be someone like me. And then there are others that feel more drawn towards the introspective path. But experientially, it makes no difference for the reason I just explained. Now, theologically, disputes often arise between these two camps. And if I have to take a stance in that area, then I'm obviously going to fall on the devotional side, which is I am going to assert that when we speak about a higher power, we're not just speaking about some impersonal force that could be regarded as just an aspect of nature in the sense that we would normally understand it, and that is basically impartial to everything that goes on. We are speaking about something that fundamentally has intent, but of course, in my own expression of mysticism, namely experiential spirituality, I go a long way to synthesizing those views, because again, this is where we go back to the distinction between God, as the term is normally used, and the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is naturally the essence of God. What we call God, when we say God, we're usually referring to the essence that directs that Spirit, and therefore all of creation. So again, to use the analogy of the physical body, it's to compare the Spirit of God to God is like comparing the physical body to the brain. I think that's an apt comparison. And I hope you're all following me so far, because I'm only beginning to get into the depths of this subject. So, before I read from this book, the Meditations on the Tarot, I'm going to put a lid on my current monologue. I'm going to read what I wrote in my own book on the subject on this dispute between the introspective path and the devotional path, which is to say, those who would say that the highest power is an impersonal force, and those who would say that the highest power has some intent, has some intelligence. Okay. Right, so I'll begin here. So I wrote in my book in chapter 11, page 200, as I have previously stated, when the terms person, and personhood are used in reference to deity, they are describing a singular intelligence with a particular character and not a human-centered egoic identity. Okay, the reason I had to draw these distinctions in the first place is that I talk a lot about how we must deny our own personhood, how our personhood is basically our egoic identity, and it's something that's transitory. And when Jesus taught we must die to ourselves, that's what he was talking about. But in classical theology, the debates surrounding God often come down to, especially in Christian theology, is he one person or three, Unitarian or Trinitarian? But we have to draw a distinction between the word person when we use it to describe ourselves in human terms and when we're talking about God. Because who is going to dare say that when we speak of God as a person, we mean the same thing as we do when we're referring to our own egoic identities? That's the distinction I'm drawing here. So when God is referred to as a person, what we're referring to is not an egoic identity in the way that we are burdened with here in the material realm. What we're talking about is, again, a singular intelligence, a very important distinction. And the reason I'm being deliberately vague here, I'll explain shortly. This distinction is vital. Okay, I go on to explain what I just explained. It's been a while since I read my own book. This distinction is vital, for to say God is a person without clarification is to invite the kind of anthropomorphizing that souls have engaged in for thousands of years, attributing all manner of petty traits to deity. It is precisely because such souls know nothing of their own transcendent nature that they reduce even God down to their own level of awareness, remaking him in their own image and according to their own lowly understandings. Conversely, there has been a habit among those influenced by Eastern thought to suppose that the kind of personal God conceived of by the Abrahamic faiths is merely a crude and erroneous misunderstanding of the impersonal force associated with the Dharmic traditions. It would surprise such souls to learn that, within the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna confirmed the supremacy of a personal intelligence many times, such as when he said, quote, "Unintelligent men, who do not know me perfectly, think that I, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, was impersonal before, and have now assumed this personality. Due to their little knowledge, they do not know my higher nature, which is imperishable and supreme." End quote. Contrary to what many would assume, the Bhagavad Gita consistently portrays devotion to a personal God as being superior to introspection and acknowledgement of a personal force. So, in the time when the Bhagavad Gita was written, there was, even then, this dispute. Is the highest manifestation of reality a personal intelligence, or is it an impersonal force? And what Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says in that statement is he's countering a certain objection or a certain understanding that existed then and that still exists now. This understanding coming from those who believe that the highest manifestation of reality is an impersonal force. What those individuals often believe, and what Krishna is countering there, is that this impersonal force that is the highest manifestation of reality, it can nonetheless manifest as deities of various kinds. And so, while most of those on the introspective path would acknowledge this impersonal force as being the highest manifestation of reality, they don't therefore deny the existence of gods of various kinds. It's just that they would see it as that impersonal force manifesting those things for different reasons. Mind you, on the most basic level, I've always struggled with that perspective. See, we have to be very careful when we're speaking about God, because we are speaking about God. One title I love for God is the ineffable one. God is that which is beyond understanding. So you should feel embarrassed and ashamed and stupid every time you attempt to comprehend God with your mind or try to articulate something about God, as I'm about to now. But sometimes it can't be avoided. So I have a problem with that perspective that the highest manifestation of reality is an impersonal force, on the basis that the moment you say something like, well, this impersonal force can manifest as what we would understand as gods, you're bestowing that impersonal force with intent. Does that not itself suggest that something is amiss here? If this impersonal force gave rise to all of creation, why did it do so? Was it just in its nature to do so? Is it just the way it is? Many would say this, it's just the way it is. This impersonal force, this eternal consciousness, this spirit, whatever you will call it, it just exists. It is what it is. It has no intent. It doesn't look down in judgment in any way, shape, or form. It just is, and that's enough. But when you start having it behave in certain ways, like manifesting deities, I don't know, I've always had a slight issue with that. The point is, the Bhagavad Gita is staunchly against that view. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita makes clear that no, those who say that I, the Godhead, am an impersonal force, their understanding is imperfect, because I, Krishna, am above that personal force. I'm not some manifestation of an impersonal force. I, Krishna, the Supreme, am here, and I am the ultimate, and I am a personal intelligence. It's essentially what that's laying out. So, I hope at least the issue at hand here is clear. Now, not because I couldn't have, but as I explain in the book, because I think it's best not to, I talked about the ways that we can experience the Spirit, or we can experience God, certainly the ways that we can interact with those higher manifestations of reality and ourselves. What I did not do in the book is start willy-nilly elaborating upon the nature of God, for reasons I explained recently, which is that it's kind of silly to do so. God is ineffable. What we understand about God must come primarily through our direct experience of that. And that, who can speak of? It's direct experience of a very profound kind. And the joy that we gain from that and the understanding that we gain from that is, by its very nature, necessarily going to remain our own because of the way it was obtained and because of the way you can't take that kind of experiential knowledge, that kind of gnosis, that kind of revelation, that kind of divine insight and just dish it out to people. You can try in articulating it. That's what I'm doing. But ultimately, the full flavor of that experience can only be yours, and it can only belong to the one that undergoes the experience. So my reluctance to articulate more on God as an intelligence, what his plans might be, what his ideas are, and so forth, I restrained myself from speaking much about that. It's something that, again, you have to remain very humble about. You can't be glib about it. Now, this author, and what I'm about to read here, this author does have something to say on the subject of, first of all, this dichotomy between God as an impersonal force and God as a higher intelligence. More than that, he has something to say about the supremacy of that personal force over that impersonal intelligence. So I hope everything I've articulated so far is clear. See why I was at once looking forward to this live stream, but it's also, quite frankly, consumed my week in terms of thinking about how I was going to articulate these things, how I would present this information, because this is highly abstract stuff. And it's one of those situations where, if you know a subject inside out, quite often you can fall into the trap of, when you're trying to explain it to someone else, you can fall into the trap of explaining things in a way that when you're articulating the explanation to you, you think, yeah, that's a perfectly good explanation, but that's only because you're assuming so much knowledge. You forget what it's like to not know those things. And it's hard to step outside of yourself and see beyond that. So I hope what I've said so far is okay. Now I'm going to read a significant portion of what this author says in this book now. And as I do so, I'm going to stop and clarify his comments. Now, please don't take offense at that. Please don't feel I'm being demeaning or patronizing towards you. It's just that, especially being on YouTube, you have to get into the habit of assuming the least amount of knowledge among those watching. Because I know for a fact, if I just read what this book says in this section I'm going to read, and I don't stop to explain, especially in light of my own perspective, which I've shared with you many times, what this author is saying, there's going to be more than a few individuals that are going to be completely lost. And then what's the point in this live stream? The whole point of my mandate in the first place, as I said recently, was to make difficult subject matter, spiritual subject matter, hopefully easy to understand. So I'm going to continue in that fashion. So in this section of the book, this is the second chapter, and so therefore the author is elaborating upon the priestess card. Because the priestess is the second card of the major arcana. And it's when elaborating upon the priestess, or the high priestess, that he gets into this discussion of an impersonal force versus a personal force, and to the subject of this live stream, the significance of God as love as he sees it. So, okay, so the author says, yet, what is the full significance of the adoption of the primacy of being instead of that of good, or according to St. John, that of love? So right away, I have to explain what he's talking about there. This author, when he speaks about love or good, usually love, he's speaking about God. When he speaks about being, he's speaking about consciousness or spirit. In other words, when he speaks about love, he's speaking about the personal intelligence. When he's speaking about being, he's speaking about the impersonal force, which makes sense and is completely in line with my own view that I've expressed many times. Being, because, as I've said, as souls, we are of that great spirit that men call God. We are of that same essence. So when we're talking about the impersonal force, we're talking about our own being. So when the author says being, he's referring to what even the introspective practitioners will recognize, this impersonal force. Something a Buddhist would recognize immediately. When he speaks about love, he's referring to the nature of the intelligence that drives that force, i.e. the personal intelligence. The idea of being is neutral from the point of view of the moral life. There is no need to have the experience of the good and the beautiful in order to arrive at it. The experience solely of the mineral realm already suffices to arrive at the morally neutral idea of being. For the mineral is. For this reason, the idea of being is objective, i.e. it postulates, in the last analysis, the thing underlying everything, the permanent substance behind all phenomena. He's saying in his own rather dense way, abstruse way, what I said earlier, which is that if you believe the highest manifestation of reality is this impersonal force, then, as many people do see it, you can interpret it as being just what is, with no explanation required. It's just what is. That's why this author is saying it doesn't require anything from the moral life. It could easily be some kind of naturalistic phenomenon, because it simply is. It's just a naturalistic phenomenon that is beyond material science as it currently exists. Naturally, I take a different perspective on that, and so does this author. I invite you, dear unknown friend, to close your eyes and to render an exact account of the image which accompanies this idea in your mental imagination. Do you not find the vague image of a substance without colour or form very familiar to water in the sea? And how often have I used the example of an ocean when speaking about the spirit, especially in comparison to ourselves? I often talk about how the spirit is like the ocean, we as souls are like droplets of that ocean. Whatever your subjective representation of being as such, the idea of being is morally indifferent and is consequently essentially naturalistic. It implies something passive, i.e. a given or unalterable fact. In contrast, when you think of love in the Johannine sense, Johannine meaning the books in the New Testament that are attributed to the Apostle John, usually the Gospel of John, the 3 letters of John, and more often than not, I would say the Book of Revelation. Some dispute whether the Book of Revelation was written as by the same John, and whether it should therefore be considered Johannine literature, but certainly your average Christian would consider it such. Possibly. It's really irrelevant, but when he says Johannine literature, let's just say he's certainly referring to the Gospel of John especially, and certainly the first letter of John. That's enough. In contrast, when you think of love in the Johannine sense, or of the Platonic idea of good, you find yourself facing an essential activity which is in no way neutral from the point of view of moral life, but which is the heart itself. And the image which accompanies this notion of pure actuality would be that of fire or of the sun. Plato compared the idea of good to the sun and its light to truth. So in other words, Plato had this analogy of the sun as pure goodness, and the rays of the sun as the truth that emanates, if you will, or that is projected from that pure goodness. It's a nice little image. In place of the image of an indefinite fluid substance, Thales and Heraclitus have 2 different conceptions. The one sees in water the essence of things, and the other sees it in fire. But here, primarily, it is so that the idea of good and its summit, love, is due to the conception of the world as a moral process, whereas the idea of being and its summit is due to the conception of the world as that of a fact of nature. So here the author is basically trying to say that, in his own convoluted way, that is again refers to this issue of the way that the Apostle John and Plato conceived of things is suggestive of creation being on account of some active benevolent force, whereas, well, I immediately think of the demiurge there. Whereas, again, with the impersonal force, it could easily just be just a thing that is. There's no morality to it. There's no real drive to it. What it did one day, it could do the opposite the next day for no apparent reason, because it's just playing out according to its nature as things do in the material realm. So again, it has nothing to do with what the author describes as the moral life. The idea of good and of love is essentially subjective. It is absolutely necessary to have had experience of psychic and spiritual life in order to be able to conceive of it, whilst, as we have already indicated, the idea of being essentially objective, presupposes only a certain degree of outward experience, of the mineral realm, for example. So what he's saying here is that substantiating love is one thing, and is something that is exclusive to the one who has delved deeply into spirituality, where as substantiating the notion of this kind of neutral force, this impersonal force, doesn't require much, and indeed that is self-evidently so, because again we're talking about the fabric of being here. The mere fact that I am in front of this PC is enough to confirm the existence of being, at least my own being, because I am here, you know. As St. Francis of Assisi said, what you're looking for is where you were looking. What you're looking for is where you were looking from. The fact that I'm here experiencing these things is enough to validate being. That's what the author means there. Okay, and this is where we get to the dichotomy that I talked about earlier. This dichotomy between what I in my book describe as the devotional path and the introspective path. the personal intelligence and the impersonal force. The consequence of choosing between these two, I will not say points of view, but rather attitudes of the soul, interesting way to put it, lies above all in the intrinsic nature of the experience of practical mysticism, which consequently derives from this choice. In other words, the way that one engages in their mystical practice will ultimately determine which stance they take on this issue. He who chooses being, the impersonal force, will aspire to true being, and he who chooses love will aspire to love, to the personal intelligence, to God. For one only finds that for which one seeks. The seeker for true being, the one on the introspective path, will arrive at the experience of repose. You don't often see that. I most often see the word repose in stiff translations of the ancient Gnostic texts. Repose just means rest. The seeker for true being will arrive at the experience of rest in being, and, as there cannot be two true beings, the illegitimate twofoldness of St. Martin, or two separate co-eternal substances, but only one being and one substance, the central false being will be suppressed. The characteristic of this mystical way is that one loses the capacity to cry. An advanced pupil of yoga or Vedanta will forever have dry eyes, while the masters of the Kabbalah, according to the Zohar, cry much and often. Christian mysticism speaks also of the gift of tears as a precious gift of divine grace. The Master, Jesus, cried in front of the tomb of Lazarus. Thus, the outer characteristic of those who choose the other mystical way, that of the God of love, is that they have the gift of tears. This is in keeping with the very essence of their mystical experience. Their union with the divine is not the absorption of their being by divine being, but rather the experience of the breath of divine love, the illumination by divine love, and the warmth of divine love. The soul which receives this undergoes such a miraculous experience that it cries. In this mystical experience, fire meets with fire. Then nothing is extinguished in the human personality, but, on the contrary, everything is set ablaze. This is the experience of legitimate twofoldness, or the union of two separate substances in one soul essence. The substances remain separate as long as they are bereft of that which is the most precious in all existence, free alliance and love. So what on earth is that talking about there? Okay, to put it into my own terminology, what he's saying there, and you have surely noticed this characteristic of my own, the way I express things, is that I've often de-emphasized emotion, certainly de-emphasized personhood, and I'm not a very sentimental individual. I'm very stoic in the loose sense of the word. That's the disposition that I have, and that's precisely because of the way that I've kind of, well, as I expressed in my book, the way I've merged the introspective path with the devotional path, where even though I do acknowledge a personal intelligence that is God, that is directing things, including the impersonal force that we call spirit, nonetheless, to this author's mind, I would be someone that is more into being than into love, and therefore I have this disposition where I'm not high on emotion. I'm not prone to emotional outbursts from the joy of spirituality. I'm rather reserved in my disposition. That's what the author is articulating here, and he'll now go on to elaborate more on the distinction between those two and the importance of God as love. Oh, one more thing I need to elaborate on, because he does touch upon it there at the end. So this is another issue that is often discussed in the deepest dialogues on spirituality, but it's an issue this author just casually touches upon, which is this question of two-ness, or oneness, or duality. Boiling it down like this, is that there has been this discussion, this debate, and this exists within Buddhism as well, and I believe I've delivered one or more monologues on the subject previously. There is this discussion concerning our afterlife fate as souls. Are we to be eternally, as creations of God, are we to ultimately be eternally independent from God in the way that, say, Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden? Are we to eternally walk with God in the Garden of Eden as Adam and Eve once did? Or, as some believe, is our ultimate destiny what you might describe quite in a terrifying fashion as reabsorption or reintegration into the One, where regardless of ego or anything else, we cease to exist in any way, experientially or not, ontologically or not. We cease to exist any way independently of God. This author clearly, strongly asserts the former, that our ultimate destiny as souls is to remain as partners with God forever. That's why he created us. And that's what he's now going on to further argue. Okay. He quotes from several authors here, including Plato. I'm going to skip over that bit because it's just too dense for this live stream, which is already going to be too dense. There's things here that he alludes to that the last thing I want to do is have to elaborate upon them in this live stream. But he picks up saying, quoting from the first chapter of the Gospel of John, quote, "No one has ever seen God," end quote. I.e., no one has ever contemplated God face to face while maintaining his personality. Remember, my own emphasis in my teachings is that we must die to ourselves, as Christ said, to live to God. We must let our egoic identity fade away, as it will do inevitably. For to see God, signifies to perceive while being in the face of that which one perceives. What he's trying to say there, in his own way, is that when the author of the Gospel of John speaks about no one seeing God, what the author is meaning, according to this Christian Hermeticist, what the author is meaning is that no one can see God and still exist and still maintain an independent existence. This is something I've asserted before myself. The reason it's impossible to see God is that if we were to do so, whether physically or in our ethereal form, we would be reintegrated into that One. It would destroy us ultimately. And this author so far is in agreement with me on that point. What it would mean to see God, and why the Bible constantly says that no man can see God. For to see signifies to perceive while being in the face of that which one perceives. Before Jesus Christ there were, without doubt, numerous examples of the experience of God being seized by God, experienced of the prophets, being immersed in God, experienced of yogis and mystics in antiquity, or seeing the revelation of God's work, the world, experience of sages and philosophers in antiquity, but no one ever saw God. And just as a little side note, a brief side note, notice here how, despite the fact this guy is to a degree a religionist, a Trinitarian religionist, he's not stupid. He's very open-minded, and he accepts the legitimacy of other spiritual paths. He's quite casually bringing in yogis and types of spiritual individuals from other traditions. Because if there was one thing that was going to put me off this book, or any book, it would be someone who is sectarian. For neither the inspiration of the prophets, nor the immersion in God of the mystics, nor the contemplation of God in the mirror of the creation by the sages is equivalent to the new experience of the vision of God. The beatific vision, the beatific vision of Christian theology. So, this is the point where, okay, so far, me and this author, like that, we just use different terms to explain different things. This is the part where he starts elaborating upon things I'd never considered before, looking at things in a way I'd never thought of myself before, and this is what ultimately inspired me to share this with you, even if I myself am not sure what I make of this understanding. Again, I think it was just the pure joy of having heard something new for once, and something that genuinely challenged me and made me go, interesting. that made me really want to talk about this in a live stream. Okay, so here we go. For neither the inspiration of the prophets, nor the immersion in God of the mystics, nor the contemplation of God in the mirror of the creation by the sages is equivalent to the new experience of the vision of God, the beatific vision, I'm just going to pronounce it beatific, or no, I'm going to say beatific. It's the beatific vision of Christian theology. For this vision takes place in the domain of essence, transcending all substance. It is not a fusion, but an encounter in the domain of essence, in which the human personality, the consciousness of self, remains not only intact and without impediment, but also becomes that which is, i.e., becomes truly itself, such as the thought of God has conceived it for all eternity. Now aren't you grateful I'm stopping to explain this? So let's break this down. So this is what he's saying here, in his own way. For this vision of God, this beatific vision, takes place in the domain of essence, transcending all substance. That's all you need to understand about that sentence, really. Takes place in the domain of essence, as above all substance. What is he saying there? It actually makes perfect sense, or it will do once I put it in my own terms. When we speak about this question, or the distinction between the impersonal force of the Spirit of God and the intelligence that may or may not drive it, we are speaking about substance and essence. Because what defines the essence of anything if not the intent that drives it? Your essence is whatever drives you. If you're, for whatever reason, driven in a very violent way, that is your essence. You are in essence a violent person because you are driven in that way by your intent for whatever reason. So what the author is simply saying is that the nature of this personal intelligence is the essence, because it's that which dictates what the impersonal essence, what he calls the being, behaves. Essence, substance. Personal intelligence is necessarily the essence because, to use human language, it defines the character, whereas the impersonal force, the substance, it's, as the author said, morally neutral. It's the intent that will bestow any moral attributes on the impersonal force. That's all you need to understand about that particular sentence. And he concludes that sentence by reaffirming what he has already tried to argue, which is that the point of this is not to become reintegrated into the one, into the monad, into God, into the Spirit. It is to remain eternally as God intended us to be, as eternal companions with a sense of identity and, presumably, some form of ontological identity. The words of St. John, when thought of in this way, render intelligible those of the Master. He always calls Jesus the Master. In the Gospel of John, quote, "All who came before me are thieves and robbers," end quote. Okay, now, here we get to a particular interpretation of this verse that I'd never heard before. And who the hell would I hear this interpretation from? I mean, yeah, well, we'll get to it. And that's not to mock the interpretation. It's deeply fascinating, the way this Christian Hermeticist sees this. There is a profound mystery in these words. Indeed, how may they be understood alongside numerous other sayings of the Master referring to Moses, David, and other prophets who were all before him? In other words, why is Jesus saying that those who came before him were robbers and thieves? I.e., why is he saying something so negative about those individuals like Moses and David, who he speaks naturally as a Jew, who he speaks so highly of in other contexts? The author explains, "Now, it is a matter here not of theft and robbery, but of the principle of initiation before and after Jesus Christ." So to put it into my own way, what he's saying is that Jesus once again engaging in hyperbole, and in the same way that he said, for example, you must hate your family, he didn't really mean you should hate your family. He means that your feelings towards your family should be like hatred compared to your love towards me. Typical Jewish hyperbole, typical hyperbole that Jesus does all the time. The author's saying this statement about those that came before Jesus being thieves and robbers, it's just more hyperbole to illustrate a larger point, as is often the case in the Gospels. The masters prior to his coming taught the experience of God at the expense of the personality, and now I feel that this author is attacking me personally. The masters prior to his coming taught the experience of God at the expense of the personality, which had to be diminished when it was seized by God or immersed in God. In this sense, I'm sorry, just in case anyone is lost at that, I'm having to be very careful when I explain these things. You know, I often talk, as Jesus did, this is the problem. I often talk about, as I said before, how we must die to ourselves to live to God. The more power our egoic identity has, the less we're able to see God because our ego blinds us to it. That's why the central teaching of Jesus is that we must die to ourselves. That's what he was talking about. It's what the Apostle Paul was talking about. This author seems to have a different take on this, or at least seems to, and I'll get back to trying to synthesize these views in just a moment. In this sense, in the sense of the diminution or augmentation of the talent of gold, he refers to alchemy a lot, entrusted to humanity, the personality, which is the image and likeness of God, big, don't know about that one. The personality as the image and likeness of God, I have a different take on that. My perspective, when we are made in the image of God, it's, again, that is a simple statement affirming that we are of the same essence as God. Because, of course, the lowest religionists will take the statement we are made in the image of God as meaning that God is a humanoid. No, it's a simple statement that as God is spirit, we are spirit. That's our true nature. This author is saying that it's our own uniqueness that is in the image or likeness of God, in the sense of a personality, as he just said. So this author comes from a different perspective than I do, but thus far I've been able to see how he's saying the same thing that I've said, just in different ways. But here we're going to have to work hard to reconcile our views. The highest treasure of the children of earth is surely the personality. The masters prior to Christ were thieves and robbers. They certainly bore testimony to God, but the way which they taught and practiced was that of depersonalization, which made them witnesses, martyrs of God. The greatness of Bhagavan, the Buddha, was the high degree of depersonalization which he attained. So he's drawing a link, as I've often done, between the Abrahamic teachings and those of the Eastern traditions, which most would assume have nothing to do with one another, when they clearly do, because mystic thought is always the same wherever you find it in the world. The mystic path is always the same. The masters of yoga are masters of depersonalization. The ancient philosophers, those who really lived as philosophers, practiced depersonalization. This is the case above all with the Stoics. And this is why those who have chosen the way of depersonalization, which I would certainly be guilty of in this author's eyes, are unable to cry, and why they have dry eyes forever. For it is the personality which cries, and which alone is capable of the gift of tears. But here he quotes Jesus. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. I don't know about drawing a link between what we're talking about here and that verse from Jesus. After all, the verse from Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn. So the people in the state that Jesus is referring to are mourning. They're in a negative state. And it says they will be comforted. Is he really referring to what this author is referring to? I have my doubts about that. But yes, factually speaking, the author is obviously correct. If you've watched my content for any length of time, if you've read my book, you know exactly what he's talking about because it's conveyed through me. This truth is conveyed through me. You know the way, you know my disposition towards emotions, and you know my disposition towards the personality, and he's absolutely right when he says that the reason the approach that I take, even though I do acknowledge a personal intelligence as this author does, I do emphasize the more introspective things in many ways. The reason that results in a kind of stoic outlook and attitude towards things is because if you're de-emphasizing the personality, as the author said, what is there left to cry? If you encounter God or anything in this world, only the ego, only the personhood can be capable of tears or any form of emotion or individual expression in that way. If you're surrendering to God in the way that I emphasize, by depersonalizing self, then there is nothing left to shed tears. Therefore, as this author says, our eyes are forever dry. I feel like I'm in a courtroom on the stand before this author. Therefore, this is one aspect at least. There is also another more profound one, but I do not know if it will be possible to write about it in one of the following letters. I hope he does. According to which we may say that the mysterious words relating to thieves and robbers can become a source of radiant light. When the Gospel speaks of those who came before Christ, it is not only time which the word before designates, but also the grade of initiation. They are thieves. You can't hope to read a book from a Hermeticist without seeing the word initiation. They are thieves and robbers with respect to the personality, since they taught the depersonalization of the human being. In contrast, Jesus also says, I have come that they, the sheep, may have life and have it abundantly. In other words, the Master has come in order to render more living that which is dear to him and which is menaced with dangers, i.e. the sheep as the image of the personality. This appears inconceivable in the presence of the ideal of the personality according to Nietzsche and his Superman, or the great historical personalities such as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and the great personalities of modern times. No, dear friend, possession by the will to power or the will to glory makes neither the personality nor its greatness. The sheep in the language of love of the Master signify neither the great personality nor the little personality, but simply the individual soul which lives. Now this is where we can begin to come back together and be reconciled. He wants the soul to live without danger and to have as intensive a life as God has destined for it. The sheep is the living entity surrounded by dangers, which is the object of divine care. Doesn't this suffice? Is there too little brilliance and glory here? Is this too feeble an image to be able to arrive at, for example, a magician evoking good and evil spirits? Here, it is a matter of drawing attention to one thing, to one sole thing. The language of the Master is that of love, and not that of philosophy, psychology, or science. The powerful magician, the artistic genius, the profound thinker, and the radiant mystic certainly merit all these qualifications and perhaps still greater ones, but they do not dazzle God. In the eyes of God, they are dear sheep to him. In his consideration of them, he desires that they never go astray and that they shall have life increasingly and unceasingly. Okay, that's more than enough for this live stream, because I need to summarize that. I said as I was reading that towards the end that this is where me and the author can come back together, as it were. Because he seems to be saying towards the end there that, in agreement with myself, that the aspect of the sheep, the aspect of believers that God desires to give life more abundantly to, is not the egoic identity, but is the individual as the soul. In my terminology, what he's saying is, the life that God gives to the individual soul is not one to prolong the negative egoic identity forever, but rather to maintain the soul, the innocent soul, the pure soul forever. That pure soul being some way and unique itself. So actually, we're not saying different things. He's just going into an area where I haven't really ventured because of this emphasis and what he sees in the significance of the idea that God is love. And I think it's very pleasing that he did that, because up until he made that point, that clarification where he's not talking about God bestowing eternal life to some petty ego. Because if he hadn't made that clear, my obvious question would be, and anyone who knows what I say would have the same question, is, well then, why was the central teaching, if this is about extending or prolonging personhood in the way that I commonly use the term, then why is the central teaching of Jesus that we must die to ourselves? Why does the Apostle Paul talk about how we must be crucified with Christ to live to God, with the crucifixion clearly being a metaphor for dying to ourselves in the way that Jesus taught? If this author is saying that God, in bestowing life, is going to prolong the personality in the sense of the egoic identity, what can Jesus possibly mean? In what sense does Jesus want us to die to ourselves? That would be my burning question if the author had not clarified what he said at the end there. What he seems to be saying at the end is that our uniqueness goes beyond what I would describe as the egoic identity. Our uniqueness existed in that initial creation, in what I would describe as the ethereal realm. So before we were incarnated in flesh, before we had developed an egoic identity due to our incarnation here, in this author's mind, we had something unique about us. In the same way that if you want to read the story of Adam and Eve as an allegory for the initial creation that took place in the ethereal realms, in the same way that Adam and Eve, even in their state of innocence, they were distinct. Adam and Eve were not drones. Adam and Eve were not exactly the same. It's clear from the narrative of the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve were distinct individuals, even then, even before again they've been born into flesh and before they have an egoic identity, which is usually, in many systems of thought, the only thing that renders us one distinct from another. This author is saying there is something inherently unique about all of us from the beginning of creation. Jeez, this is getting almost provoking emotions with me. There is something eternally unique about us from the very beginning of creation, with or without egoic identity. It is inherent to us, even in our very souls. And that is what God wants to give life to. Now, if, and I think I am, if I'm understanding this author correctly, then there we can meet and we can agree. If this author was saying that God wants us to exist eternally in terms of our egoic identity, the petty egoic identity that causes all the strife here in the material realm, then I'm going to have serious problems with this author. I'm not going to put his book down. I'm going to keep reading it because he's such a knowledgeable and fascinating guy, but it's going to be very hard for me to... He's going to have to do something special to win me over again. Let's put it that way. But by the end there, again, I came to see that, okay, when this guy speaks of the personality, he's speaking of something quite different. Because I use personhood, the word personhood, interchangeably with ego. Whereas this author clearly, when he uses the word personhood, he's using it to refer to something deeper than ego. He's using it to refer to some attribute of the very soul that makes us distinct from one another even in the initial creation. Now that's something I've never frankly thought about before, but it's not an idea I have any problem with. There's no reason for me to have a problem with that. It is an idea that merits a lot of reflection, especially if we're thinking ontologically, because if we are putting the ego aside, or if we're just simply speaking about that original heavenly creation, souls are indeed, as this author will acknowledge, one with the Spirit of God. We are all consciousness. But then, what is that quality? What is that attribute from one soul to another that would make one soul different from another? Because, as I've emphasized time and time again, spirit is just spirit. Consciousness is just consciousness. I don't know if this author is going to provide those kind of answers. I would be amazed if he didn't. Bearing in mind, there's 22 chapters in this book. I've only read 2 chapters because I read those first 2 chapters and I thought, okay, I've got to talk about this in a live stream. And I don't dare read any more of this book lest I read something else that I'd love to elaborate upon in a live stream. And that's it. If this ending of this live stream feels rather abrupt, but if this live stream hasn't provided everyone with at least something to think about, I don't know what else to do. But I just felt led to share that with you. You know, it is kind of interesting that I felt so compelled to do so when I obviously differ from this author in many ways, certainly theologically, and when at a certain point he's criticizing something that is largely my approach, namely the kind of depersonalization and the kind of stoic disposition it leads to. But I don't mind doing that. I'm not precious about my own ideas because I recognize that they are just ideas. When I speak from my direct experience, that's something else. But my ideas are just my ideas, and ideas about, when we're speaking about the nature of God, the personal intelligence that we call God, who the hell cares what my ideas are, your ideas are, because ideas can't approach that ineffable thing. And so I just thought this would be interesting subject matter for this live stream, and I'd love to hear what you make of this. I don't know. I have no idea what you're going to make of this. All I'll say now, after over an hour, is thank you very much once again for supporting me here on Patreon. Yeah, this live stream has left me kind of speechless, so I guess I'll just leave it there. Thank you.